Hello, everybody. I wanted to welcome everyone to this panel that we're doing. My name is Omar Herrera. I'm the Executive Director at the Durham Community Legal Clinic. We will have this session moderated by Jansu Aydemir and Darshani Arumugam, who are both law students, Jansu at Osgood and Darshani at Windsor, and they will be introducing our panelists momentarily. Before we get started, though, we did want to do a poll, and we're going to see if this works. The first question is, presuming that the audience knows something about universal basic income, whether or not they would support universal basic income. And I'm going to see if I can set this up here. And this poll will only be for the audience that's on Zoom. I know we have a Facebook audience as well, but they will not be, unfortunately, able to participate in this particular poll. So let's see if this works. We're going to launch the poll now. We'll just give a couple seconds here for the 60 or so people that are currently on the call on Zoom. And that might be all that we are going to get for now in terms of the response. So let's just see what those results of that poll were. So we do have a very strong support. I mean, there's a selection bias here in terms of universal basic income. That may or may not change. We'll see how it goes. Maybe there's some pitfalls or shortcomings that people may not have anticipated. But with that, I'm going to pass it on to Jansu and Darshani. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our discussion about universal basic income. My name is Jansu Aydemir. My colleague, Darshani Arumugam, and I will be moderating today's panel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Darshani. Thank you again for joining us today. So the topic of basic universal income, although has been around for a while now, I think is especially relevant during these unprecedented times. This pandemic has certainly made everyone question our standard of living and how much money and income a family truly needs to live a dignified life. So simply put, basic income ensures a minimum income level regardless of employment status. And this is different from social assistance because basic income can be given to anyone who meets the income eligibility criterion. It can be given to someone who may be working but is just earning below the basic income level. And it's generally simpler to administer than social assistance. Oh. All right. So today we have with us here to share their expertise. There to share their expertise and experiences surrounding universal income. So our first speaker we have is Tom Cooper. And Tom Cooper is from the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. For the past 9 years, Tom has served as the director for the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And this is a collaborative organization formed to tackle the poverty in Hamilton. Through the Roundtable's work, Tom has engaged governments at all levels to invest in poverty reduction initiatives. Secondly, we have Professor Wayne LEWCHUK with us. He is a professor in the School of Labor Studies and Department of Economics at McMaster University. He holds an MA in Economic History from U of T and a PhD in Economics from the University of Cambridge. And he also recently published an evaluation of Hamilton's Basic Income Pilot Project.
And our third speaker is Samir NURMOHAMED. He is a director at Basic Income Canada and a lawyer at Osler in Toronto. He studied economics at Cornell University and law at the University of Toronto. While studying, he became interested in tax law and policy as a vehicle for prosperity and equality. Samir is most excited about a UBI funded by reformed and streamlined tax and welfare systems in order to eliminate stigma and welfare gaps, grow the economy through a fairer taxation, and decimate poverty. And finally, we have Dana Bowman with us. She is a community activist and a volunteer for poverty reduction. She was a recipient of the Basic Income Pilot Project, which is now canceled. She is one of the 4 litigants for civil action lawsuit against the government in regards to canceling the pilot.
And I think we just had Ryan Turnbull join us. Thank you very much for joining us. Ryan Turnbull is the Member of Parliament for Whitby, one of our local ridings here that is served by the Durham Community Legal Clinic, and wanted to provide some introductory remarks. So Ryan, we're going to turn it on to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. And Omar, thanks for having me and inviting me. I think this is a great initiative. You know, as a member of Parliament and previously in the space of the social service sector, working with lots of nonprofit organizations, I've had the conversation come up about universal basic income quite a number of times, and was very impressed by some of the previous pilot projects with the Ontario government under the previous leadership. And I think during this pandemic, we've certainly seen how the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the level that it was set at provided something similar to a universal basic income. I'm not sure whether I would equate the two. They're not identical, but certainly there is some appetite at this point that may not have previously existed for considering the implications of looking at CERB and reconsidering how it's structured to sort of consider basic income. I think I'm certainly in principle supportive of that. I think there's huge cost benefits and social benefits. If we look at a full sort of cost benefit analysis, we have to consider the social return on investment. And I think the many cost savings to administer our various levels of social assistance that we have. Anyhow, I will leave it at that, but I just think it's great to be having these open discussions and considering basic income models. And I know there's quite a number of members of the Liberal caucus across the country that are entertaining this as one proposal of numerous ones, but certainly I think there's some support there for, and I'm really happy to be part of and listen to the discussion today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, thank you for that. So our speakers will be answering any questions anyone has at the end of the panel. So feel free to either leave your questions through either the Zoom chat or our Facebook comments at any time. So let me just share the screen again so we can see the questions. Okay, so our first question is for Tom. Tom, you were part of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project. So can you share with us an overview of that project, please?
Thanks, Darshani, and it's great to see everybody, and it's a pleasure being involved in this really important panel discussion at this critical time. The Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, just as a little bit of background, has been active in Hamilton for nearly 15 years, and our goal is to try to change conversations about poverty and to highlight the voices of people who are experiencing poverty. And personally, I wasn't necessarily convinced that basic income or universal basic income was the right approach to reducing poverty. But that has changed for me, and that's really come from our experience in observing the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Project. And I certainly knew of the fantastic work that had been done on this issue, on the idea of basic income, particularly by Dr. Evelyn Forget and by former Senator Hugh Segal. But the experiments that had been tried in Canada before are nearing 50 years old now. And I just wasn't convinced that necessarily basic income was the right approach to move people out of poverty. You know, reforming the social assistance system, and we probably all know that rates are woefully inadequate, and pushing for livable wages were something that we had focused our efforts on over most of our history as an organization. But that all changed in 2017 when former Premier Kathleen Wynne came to town and said that Hamilton, along with the town of Lindsay and along with Thunder Bay in Northern Ontario, were going to be testing this idea of basic income. And I have to tell you, although I wasn't convinced at the time that it was going to work, and we often say in poverty reduction work, there isn't a silver bullet to reducing poverty, but I can tell you that there, in my opinion, hasn't been a project that has been more transformative in terms of moving people out of poverty as quickly as basic income did, even though it was truncated, it didn't last, it was cut short by the new provincial government. But just as a little bit of background to the pilot, there were about 4,000 people who were involved in the basic income pilot. They were randomly selected, and you had to be low income and living in one of those communities, Hamilton, Lindsay, or Thunder Bay. And it enabled people who were earning less than $34,000 a year, and perhaps working several part-time jobs, as many of the basic income participants were doing, could apply. But also people who were on social assistance could apply. And many did, particularly those who were on Ontario Works, saw basic income as a really good opportunity to change things in their lives, to get better housing, to eat healthier, to have a better health for themselves and their families. And so we saw people, although it got off to a slow start and people didn't necessarily trust the idea of the government giving people money, after local community organizations got involved in helping to highlight what were some of the pros and cons of basic income, we did have quite a bit of uptake in the project. And in Hamilton, more than about 1,200 people were involved in the pilot. In Lindsay, it was about 1,800 people, and in Thunder Bay, I believe it was about 900 people. And Wayne's going to speak in a little bit about some of the experiences of those participants, but from my observations over the 12 or 18 months that people received a basic income, it was absolutely phenomenal in terms of being able to help people stabilize housing, help them to eat healthier. People who were on social assistance on Ontario Works for years and were used to going to food banks quite often because those rates are so woefully inadequate, were able to go and purchase food for themselves and actually have food in their freezers for the first time. Individuals were able to buy brand new winter coats, something they had never done before. They'd been used to hand-me-downs or going to thrift shops, and now they were able to have that dignity of being able to buy their first ever winter coat. People were also going back to school, and we'll get into this conversation about whether it's a disincentive to work. And some people did quit jobs, but some of those people were working 3 or 4 part-time jobs and simply had no time for any sort of social interaction with family or to be able to just relax. And so sometimes people did quit one or two of those jobs. And other people made plans to go back to school and improve their skills so they could get better jobs. Unfortunately, as many of you know, the dreams and aspirations of those 4,000 basic income participants were cut short when the new provincial government was elected. And despite promising not once, but twice during the election that they would keep the pilot project going and see it through and look at the data and look at the evaluation, they decided after a month in office that they were going to cancel the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. It threw the lives of those 4,000 people into chaos. Individuals who had moved into safer housing, for example, if they had family members, were left really out in the lurch in places they could no longer afford. People who had planned to go back to school had to put those dreams on hold. And people who had been eating healthier for a long time had no choice but to go back to the food banks on social assistance once the program had ended. So I believe from my experience, from my observations, that the Ontario Basic Income pilot was transformative. It helped move people out of poverty, at least set them on the course to do that, even if they didn't get all the way out of poverty. And I think, given our current situation with the international pandemic and the economic upheaval that's followed, I think a universal basic income will be the right approach for Canada in the future. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful project. And Wayne, you've worked on a recent report called Southern Ontario's Basic Income Experience, and you've also worked on the Hamilton Pilot Project. So can you share with us your work on both of these projects, please?
Sure, Durham. So again, like Tom, I sort of come to believe in basic income a bit late in life. For me, that's quite late in life. It comes really from my experience both with doing some research with the people from ODSP and revealing really the depth of poverty of most people on ODSP who they experience, but also the surveillance system that they're subjected to, which in some cases can be actually quite dehumanizing. And so it's obviously a system that needs to be changed. But more to the point is my own background as an economic historian and what's happened in labor markets in the last 50 years has convinced me that we need something different. So if we go back to the 1980s, what's happened in the last 5 decades, it's half a century, it's unbelievable. Wages have not moved, real wages for the average person. In that 50 years, the distribution of income has become increasingly skewed to just the top 10%. So while productivity has continued to grow, all of those benefits have been captured by the top 10% in the income profile. The employment itself has become increasingly insecure. So people, as Tom said, are working multiple part-time jobs. They're working in the gig economy. They're concerned about artificial intelligence taking over their jobs. We're switching to a knowledge economy, which means people move around jobs a lot more. So I think what we have now is a situation where we have a lot of labor institutions that were implemented after World War II in the 60s and the 70s that, to be quite frank, are quite dated. They no longer serve the purposes that they were designed for, given this new labor market where increasingly employment is insecure, et cetera. And so it seems to me that basic income is really a 21st century form of labor market regulation for a 21st century labor market. And it really does fit in with what's happening in the labor market. So we were asked to have a look at the basic income pilot in Hamilton, along with Tom's shop, the Hamilton Poverty Roundtable. They were partners in this. And so we surveyed over 200 Hamilton participants. We interviewed about 40. And we put together a report, which is available on the Labor Studies website, looking at those people's experience. I think to summarize, it was a smashing success. Basically, almost everybody who was on basic income reported their life had improved. Mental health improved, outlook on life improved, household well-being improved. It was just a success. What is perhaps more surprising is the greatest benefits were not reported by people who are on ODSP. Certainly they did report benefits. The greatest benefits of being on basic income was reported by people who are in that precarious labor market, who were working before the pilot, and most of whom continue to work during the pilot. So these are people in low income, often in minimum wage jobs, short-term contracts, working through temp agencies, driving Uber, delivering food through Foodora, et cetera, working in this new labor market where employment is just not secure. Many more people don't have these kind of lifetime jobs. And so what we found is that while everybody reported an improvement in mental health, the greatest improvement was actually amongst those who were employed prior to the pilot, not those on ODSP. While everyone reported a better outlook on life, the greatest improvement was those who were employed before the basic income, not after. And I think this just speaks to how basic income not only solves a serious social welfare and poverty problem, it also facilitates a labor market where an increasing number of people are insecure and precarious. We also looked at the question of employment. Did people take the basic income, put their feet up and watch the Maple Leafs on hockey? I mean, it's a very bad strategy no matter who you are. But that's not what happened. The vast majority of people who worked before the pilot continued to work after the pilot. And many of them moved into jobs that were paid better and had better long-term prospects. So what exactly is going on here? I think what was going on here is that people used the basic income as a floor below which they couldn't fall, and therefore they could take some chances. They could take chances on going back to school and re-entering the labor market later on and in a better position. They could take a chance on abandoning an abusive, insecure, low-paid job and taking a chance on another job that maybe it would work, maybe it wouldn't. But if it didn't work, they knew they had the basic income to fall back on. So our interpretation of is what happened in the 12 months is that basic income gave an increasing number of people the confidence to fully realize their potential in the labor market rather than adopting short-term strategies to simply put food on the table. Now, unfortunately, the pilot ended prematurely. Realistically, it was only going for 12 months before the government made the announcement it would be closing down. Benefits continued for another 6 months. And that prevented us from really fully understanding to what extent were people able to go back to school and really improve their skills and enter the labor market later on at a higher level. To what extent would the improvement in mental health and outlook on life have made people more employable and allowed them to access to better jobs in the long run? We really don't have that data because the pilot was cut off prematurely. So then I think just to summarize, the basic income certainly solves a serious shortcoming of our welfare system and ODSP, but more important, it supports a labor market where an increasing number of people are in insecure and precarious employment and need some kind of basic support in order to function and fully realize their potential in the labor market. I'll end there.
Thank you, Wayne. And Dana, you were a part of the pilot project. So how was your experience?
Yes, my experience with the basic income pilot was, first off, very freeing and did give me a lot of dignity, standing simple things in the grocery store and not because I could budget out and I wasn't always just going once a month and shopping day old sections and doing my level best and shopping healthy. So I wasn't feeling there's a status around, I live in a very small town. I'm actually one of the recipients in Lindsay. So it kind of some reputation about, oh, it's welfare day or it's baby bonus day or those kind of statements in it. And it took that away. That took that away right there. So I definitely felt a lot more dignity out and about, that I was more financially responsible for myself as well. I could afford to buy over-the-counter prescriptions that aren't covered by, because I also am an ODSP recipient. So a lot of prescriptions, antihistamines, things like that aren't covered. So I'm grateful to what's covered though. But at the same time, there was other things I needed that aren't covered. And I found myself in a need with an allergic reaction, and I could do it all in one time. And that is unusual. Also too, with being an ODSP recipient, I planned a little late, mind you, but at the same time, I was going to go back to college, was the plan. The first year I helped my daughter, not even the first year, I helped my daughter get on her feet and get her off and going. Not financially, she's financially responsible herself, just supported her in a different manner. And my goal was to get back into college because of being on ODSP, I'm considered unemployable. So it took that status away. I could actually go and look at being in college, upgrade my skills, have my prescriptions covered, and be able to afford, because I would lose all of those things on ODSP because I'm considered unemployable. I would lose my prescription coverage, and it is so much in expense-wise, I can't afford to leave it. So it gave me the freedom to look at doing college courses. It gave me knowing that I could do these things without fear of losing my income or my my coverage is a better word for putting it. I also felt empowered. I don't know if that goes back to my financial responsibilities, but ODSP definitely, you know, I just let them do what they needed to do. And, you know, here's my rent paid automatically. Here's, you know, here's these things that are done for me. And so I just sat back and let it happen. But it did feel good to be able to take financial responsibility back for myself and budget and have income there for healthy foods, and making improvements on lifestyle choices as well. So it was empowering. There's no other word to say it. It was empowering, knowing that I could make plans for my future and get off the system as I know it.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Dana. And I think we can continue with Samir. Samir, in 2018, you presented a UBI FIT funding model to the North American Basic Income Congress. Can you please tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on the panel. It's an honor to be here and to speak with everyone. I think I'll start probably a bit back in maybe 2009 or 2010 when I first heard about a basic income. And I think rather predictably, I thought it was a terrible idea. You know, if you just kind of do the math and say, if we give everyone, you know, $20,000 or $25,000 a year, that's going to be extremely expensive and it's just totally unaffordable. And so I kind of thought that. I was convinced by the critics and then I forgot about it. Fast forward to about 2017 and I started to see things about basic income in the pilot, and I started to learn about it, and I realized that math, although a simple multiplication of, you know, $24,000 a year times 30 million Canadians is correct, it actually has a lot of deep flaws, and I want to come back to that in terms of how it actually works. So I'll leave you hanging for the moment. But in 2018, I had the opportunity to present at the North American Basic Income Congress, which is basically a program that comes on every year in around May or June. Unfortunately, we couldn't have it this year. And it's between America and Canada, who kind of bring a bunch of people interested in basic income together. And so I'm mentioning that just because I think that's a great program to go to. I'd really recommend it if you're looking for a little bit more information on basic income. And what I talked about there was what I called a UBI FIT. And what that means is a universal basic income, and that's UBI, with a flat income tax, and that's the FIT. So I should probably mention here that I'm a lawyer, and I've got to have the usual sort of disclaimer that none of these opinions are that of my law firm or my clients or anyone like that. They're obviously my own opinions and don't affect my practice. None of this is legal advice, you know, et cetera. The idea behind a UBI FIT is, if you look at our current tax system, we have what I would say is a progressive rate system without actually having a progressive tax system. So as you earn more and more income, you pay a higher tax rate on any marginal income you make. But what you'll find is that our system is actually full of tax breaks. And these tax breaks tend to be very regressive, which means that as you really only get most of the benefit of the tax break if you have enough income, if you're rich enough. And so interestingly, we have sort of a system of sticker shock, you know, where you go to the Bay and you say, oh, wow, that shirt looks really nice. Oh, it's $149.99. Like, that's crazy. But by the time you get all the discounts, it actually comes to $30. That's actually a lot like our tax system. So in Ontario, the highest income earners actually pay 53.53% tax on every marginal dollar. And if you think about that, that means that the tax system is getting more than half of what these people make. And maybe that sounds unfair until you realize that there's a whole bunch of tax breaks that you can potentially use at that income level to actually reduce what you pay in taxes. And so what we end up having is a system that appears progressive but isn't really progressive. And that kind of led me to this UBI flat tax idea, because we don't need to have a progressive tax rate system that is not progressive. We could simply have a flat tax system, which is obviously also not progressive. But to make it progressive, we could have a UBI. So now I want to step back and just talk about what I mean by UBI. Basic income sounds very simple, but there's actually a lot of different interpretations of it. The two main interpretations are between what I would call something like a guaranteed basic income on the one hand and a universal basic income on the other hand. So the idea of a guaranteed basic income is a lot like what Darshani talked about in the first place, and a lot like the basic income pilot. The idea is that only the people that really need a basic income will actually get it. And as you start to earn income, you'll start to lose how much of that basic income you get. So if you make, say, $40,000 or $50,000, you won't get any. But if you make less than that, you'll get a little bit. And if you make nothing, you'll get the full basic income. And so the result is that we guarantee you that you will never be below a certain income floor. The other idea is a universal basic income. And it says, living in Canada, it's your right to have a basic income. You are entitled to not be in poverty. And we need to make sure that everyone is out of poverty. Also, the wealth in this country and the income in this country, sure, it should go to some extent to the people who earned it, but some of it should also really accrue to everyone. It's the collective benefit of everyone. And so there's this idea that we should pay out a dividend. You know, if you own a share in a company, you get paid a dividend because of your share of that company. But if you live in Canada, the idea is you should get a dividend by being a member of Canada, by being a resident of Canada or a citizen of Canada. And so that's the dividend concept. And so critics will often say, why on earth would you pay a universal basic income to everyone? Why should we pay it to the people who own Loblaws? Why should we pay it to the richest Canadians? And the answer to that is that we can increase their taxes, right? So we can give everyone a basic income, but as you earn more, you'll pay more in taxes. And so the net result here is that if you don't earn anything, you'll get the full basic income. If you're middle class, you might pay a little bit in taxes, but you'll get a big basic income. And so the result of this system, and it depends on how you model it, but the way that I've modeled it is that 99% of workers can actually be better off. Obviously, the lower income you are, the more better off you will be. But 99% of workers can actually be made better off. And I think this is a very important point because critics of basic income will often say, well, why should people who work and just got a job, why should those people have to pay for the people that just, won't get up off the couch and get a job? And of course, these ideas are extremely pejorative and false, but they're also mathematically wrong. And that's the point I'm trying to make, which is that the average worker, full-time worker, a minimum wage worker, or making, say, $40,000, $50,000 a year in Canada can actually be made better off. And so the way that we've designed this system is, and you can see a PowerPoint that I've had of an earlier version of this system online, but the current model that I'm looking at is that every Canadian should get $24,000 a year basic income. So that's $2,000 a month. And you'd get paid monthly or bi-monthly. And every Canadian would pay a 38% flat tax. And this would completely balance the budget. So it wouldn't result in any debt. And if you were making, let's say, $100,000 a year, you would actually come out ahead. And the reason for that is you might pay a little bit more in taxes, but you'll get a lot more in a basic income. And this is interesting because if you were someone making $100,000 a year this year, but next year you lost your job, well, next year you would get that $24,000. And so not only are you better off, but it also helps with the volatility of everyday jobs and life. And I think this is no more important than during the times of COVID, when so many people have lost their jobs. And it's not enough to say, well, you're still getting a little bit of money from your work, you weren't totally fired, or you chose to voluntarily quit, so you shouldn't get any money from the government. This program is completely neutral to your choices. It says you decide however you want to live your life, but we will make sure that you never fall below $24,000 a year. And so we'll always give you a basic income. And I just want to make one final point, and then I'll turn it over, which is that we like to think of basic income as an income. It's an income that you get not for working, but simply by being a Canadian, and you get it from the government. But you can also think about basic income as wealth or as capital. And so if you think about capital versus labor, and if you think about labor as getting income for working, and capital as paying you a dividend or paying you rent, not for working, but simply because you have wealth, because you own an asset. Well, a basic income is actually a lot like that. The idea is that you have this wealth that every month will pay you your dividend, it'll pay you your rent. And this is important because in the West, we have extremely unequal distributions of wealth. We have unequal distributions of income, but we have even more unequal distributions of wealth. And there's a racial lens to this as well. In America, the average Black household has 10% the wealth of the average white household. So if we were to ensure that everyone had this capital, Black families and white, other families as well, we have immediately redistributed capital without actually confiscating anybody's money, but we've immediately redistributed capital to ensure that everyone has a share of the wealth. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Samir. Yeah, you definitely touched on a lot of questions that I'm sure a lot of the taxpayers have regarding UBI. We're definitely going to come back to that. But in this part of the panel, we're going to ask the panelists some general questions regarding UBI and what the critics of UBI are saying, just to get their views on these issues. But first, we wanted to talk about the history of UBI in the world and in Canada. Tom, I know you have great insights on this, but if anyone wants to jump in at any time, feel free to do so. But yeah, why don't we start with you, Tom?
Thanks, Darshani. Yeah, and the idea of basic income isn't new by any means. It's been talked about since ancient Greece, and even in 16th century England. Sir Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia, in which he, in a sense, endorsed the idea of a basic income for everybody. At that time, there was a lot of theft because people were going hungry, and he was decrying the fact that people were being hanged for stealing bread. And he thought a better idea might be, as Samir sort of pointed out, that if everybody had a foundation, a solid foundation, that it would be a lot better for society. The idea of basic income has evolved over the years, certainly. It's been talked about a lot in the United States, never really implemented on a large scale, although conservative thinkers like Milton Friedman liked the idea, as well as more progressive voices like Martin Luther King Jr. He thought the idea of a guaranteed income fit absolutely with the civil rights movement and would be a important progressive social policy moving forward. And he talked about that in the 1960s. Even former President Richard Nixon toyed around with the idea of a basic income, although it didn't pass the US Congress because many of them didn't feel it was generous enough at the time. But as I alluded to in my earlier comments, Canada had an experiment, Mincome, in the 1970s. That was a joint provincial federal initiative that ran for 5 years in Manitoba, and the saturation site for that experiment was in Dauphin, Manitoba. But we didn't really learn much about it. New governments were elected, and it was canceled. Very similar to the situation in Ontario with our pilot project, although it was a little bit longer running. But it wasn't until 20 years later that Dr. Evelyn Forget decided to go through the data. And I think there were 1,800 boxes worth of data she combed through and really found out that the basic income experiment in Manitoba had been a profound success that nobody had talked about. And she wrote about it in her book, The Town with No Poverty. But she found that health improved, that people's well-being improved, young people stayed in school longer and got better jobs. And there's a great there's a great video if you have the chance to see it. You might be able to Google it or see it on YouTube. It's called The Manitoba Story, which goes back 40 years later and talks to some of those individuals who received a basic income at that time. Today, though, there's a lot of discussion about the idea of basic income. One of the presidential candidates who ran for the Democratic nomination wasn't successful, but Andrew Yang, who's an entrepreneur, based his campaign on the idea of basic income, very much what Samir was saying, a citizen's dividend. And there's been towns in the United States, and particularly recently since the pandemic, that are talking about running basic income pilot experiments. The biggest of those has been the town of Stockton, California, where a very progressive young mayor, Michael Tubbs, has launched a basic income pilot there. And although it wasn't a whole lot of money, it wasn't anywhere close to the Ontario pilot. I think Ontario's pilot project was probably the most robust we've seen anywhere in the world in terms of the amount of money people were receiving. But even on those small scales, basic income proved to be quite profound. There's other experiments being talked about in Europe, in Scotland, for example. The First Minister in Scotland's very interested in that idea, and we're working closely with our colleagues there to as they learn about our experience and we learn about theirs. Finland's tried this, that despite some early indications that it hadn't been successful, actually was extremely successful for the individuals who were involved. There's also, I'm not sure how far along it is, but interest in moving this forward on a statewide level in India. So one of the larger states in India is looking to launch a basic income. So it's being talked about. There's being smaller experiments run in Africa by charitable organizations as well. And I think just since, certainly over the last 4 or 5 months, since COVID-19 hit, it has become a huge talking point in many political circles. And as Wayne said earlier, I agree 100%. I think it's going to be the most profound social policy of the 21st century.
That's great, thank you. And again, if anyone wants to add anything, just feel free to do so. If not, I think we can jump on to the next question.
I'll just add one thing.
Yeah, sure.
Which is, this basic income idea has been around for a really long time, but what's interesting about it is that I actually, I think I led with this at the start. I don't think that I'm just unconditionally a supporter of basic income, even though I completely am now. But if we lived in a different economic climate, I don't know that it would be feasible. And if you look at our history, if you go back 200 years ago, almost everyone in the world lived in absolute poverty. And I think in a climate like that, it's basically impossible to just pull everyone out of absolute poverty by a government program. Even if you look at the most wealthy countries on earth, if you go back 200 years, real GDP per capita was $2,400. Today it's $60,000. So that's a big difference. And even if you go back 60 years, our GDP per capita has tripled. And I think the point is that we haven't seen employment incomes necessarily triple in that time period. We haven't seen support for poverty really triple in that time period. So the idea here is that you could, it might not have been feasible 60 years ago. It may not even been as feasible at the time of Richard Nixon or Milton Friedman or Mincom in Manitoba. But today, it is far more feasible than it was a generation ago. And if we were to wait another generation, it would be positively cheap. That's all I was going to say.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, so I guess we can go to the next question now.
Okay, so the next question that we have here is about UBI and other governmental benefit programs. What are the panelists' thoughts on UBI versus ODSP, OW, EI, and other governmental benefit programs? Samir, I think we can continue with you now.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I've always thought about a UBI is it's a cash program. And I think no matter what type of basic income you're looking at, I think, so if you go to Basic Income Canada Network's website, you'll see some more information on this. And that's sort of the foremost organization on basic income in Canada. And it has a primer. And the idea is that you shouldn't just support any basic income, that what we really need is a basic income that's adequate. It should actually bring everyone up to the poverty line. It's not enough to pay a basic income of $3,000 a year, right? And it should be adequate. It should be unconditional. So everyone should be entitled to it. Maybe it's based on income level, but everyone should be entitled to it. And it has to be in cash without strings attached. So when I think about what kind of programs we might replace or do away with in favor of UBI, I think that programs that have a similar objective, that are sort of paying cash to help alleviate poverty, should be eliminated. So I think you could get rid of a program like OW, which really exists to help poor people, probably far worse a program than it could be. Whereas I think ODSP is really there to help people with disabilities. And I don't think it's fair that everyone should just get the same UBI and people with disabilities don't get anything more. So, you know, I've always viewed UBI as something that can replace OW, but not something like ODSP. And I think that you can use that same sort of analysis with all kinds of government programs. And the problem that you see here is there's so many government programs that all sort of do the same sort of thing, and have different application requirements and eligibility requirements, and have traps and gaps. And, you know, if you were to replace a whole bunch of them that do the same thing with a UBI, I think it would be much simpler, and you'd actually ensure that we can solve poverty rather than, you know, putting the onus on each individual to do tons and tons of research when they're just trying to get by to figure it out.
Okay, thank you, Samir. And Dana, you just mentioned that you have experiences with ODSP. Can you also share your thoughts, please?
I really feel that UBI would really work for somebody in ODSP, because people are not inclined to sit and do nothing first. And if you're working, you don't have to worry about the clawback that is taking place with OW and ODSP. The clawback would be gone with having a UBI. We wouldn't have to need those things. I do agree with ODSP needing more, because like I mentioned earlier, prescriptions and medication wouldn't work, or the cost of it could be keep us still where we're sitting now, under the income level and the needs that do come up with people with disabilities. But at the same time, for myself, I am trainable, I am teachable, and the message that I had received from ODSP about, well, you're unemployed, you have a disability, so they couldn't invest in my income, my education. I would have lost my ODSP if I'd taken it. So I would be able to do apprenticeship or college things. There's a wide range that I wouldn't have to be stuck, like I said, in a situation that I don't want to be in, or stuck in the system, because it doesn't work. The system isn't working for us. The clawbacks are really keeping us back from moving forward. And then of course you factor in rents and other things like that. So yeah, I really do feel UBI would be a much better system in place, but we do need to look at disability factors, because not all one person fits into the same box.
Okay, thank you, Dana. So next question is, it's kind of a two-part question. It's, do you think UBI will cost our government more than CERB? Yeah, and do you think CERB is testing grounds for UBI? Wayne, I think we can start with you for this question.
I certainly think the CERB has opened our eyes to what's possible, but also I think what's necessary. Whether it costs more or less, I mean, that's a very, very complex question. And I think it's about more than simply adding up how many dollars, how many people are going to get. You have to also ask, when you give people those dollars, what else changes in their life? What is their draw on the health system, for instance? What is the potential for them to get better employment and in fact pay more taxes as a result of having that kind of support? And I don't think we really have the answers to those questions. again, unfortunately, because of the early termination of the pilot, the group that was studying those questions, which I was part of, would have been able to come up with some answers, but we don't have that data because the pilot was canceled prematurely. So I think on net, my guess is that UBI is going to come in more or less where the CERB is, but I think the CERB itself is not a very good test of UBI for two reasons. Number one, this is not a normal economy. And so people perhaps who are getting CERB who may want to work, there's no possibility because the economy has more or less shut down. People who are on CERB may want to work, but then they look at the health and safety risks of going back to work, and they may say, well, look, I'd rather stay with my $20,000 a year than risk my life and be exposed to COVID. So I think there are some real limits to using CERB as a good test of UBI, but I think it has perhaps eased the way to thinking about UBI in a broader way that we didn't think about 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I was going to ask, like, do you think CERB helps demonstrate that UBI is actually a good idea? But I'm guessing we don't have enough data to kind of come to a conclusive answer,
well,
right?
I think what CERB has shown is, you know, the world doesn't stop because you give people some money. It continues functioning. In some ways, it actually functions better. I think the problem with using CERB as a test is this is just not a normal economy. And so it's an abnormal policy for an abnormal time. And I think what we really are looking for, as I said earlier, and Tom reiterated, we're looking for a 21st century set of policies to fit a 21st century economy. And that's not what we're in right now. What we're in right now is quite an extraordinary moment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. We just asked the same question in our poll. The main concern that the public has in general about the project is whether such a program would reduce the incentive to work. So Tom and Wayne, you both have experiences on basic income projects. So we can start with you. What do you think? I know you kind of mentioned about like the answer of this question, but like, can you elaborate on that? Would it reduce the incentive to work?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, it doesn't reduce the incentive to work. It may improve the incentive to quit bad for you jobs and do something else. And we saw a lot of examples of this. So I'll give you one. One of the basic income pilot participants in Hamilton worked at one of the big banks, and his job was basically to teach people how to use the banking app on their phone, on their mobile device, and it was basically putting him out of a job because it was moving to automation. And his hours were being slowly reduced, and so when he got on basic income, he was still working for the bank. But he saw himself doing other things in life, and he wanted to be an entrepreneur, and he had an artistic bent to him, and so he took his basic income and really leveraged it to do other things and start his own business. And there's other examples of that. Dana could probably tell you about the great couple in Lindsay who were small business owners and had a larger family, but were still experiencing poverty, but were able to use that basic income to improve their business and to actually expand it. There were lots of people. People living in poverty are not lazy. They have to work extremely hard to even try to get their basic needs met. And I think we've seen, particularly over the last 4 months, as a lot of us have been confined to our homes, that this isn't something we want to do forever, right? You know, maybe a month or two of a reduced workload and not being able to engage with community is fine. But I think we're all social beings. We want to be out there. We want to be contributing to society, and we want to be part of the solution. And that goes for people experiencing poverty. So I would certainly argue from what we've observed and what we've heard from people is that basic income is not a disincentive to work. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
I think Tom is absolutely right that the story that somehow people will take a basic income and stay home and do nothing is I think it's just simply not logical. Number one, we're talking about a very basic income. We were talking in the pilot Hamilton, $17,000 a year. Certainly that puts food on the table, but it's a far stretch. It's still well below the median income in Canada. And I think the vast majority of people will want more than $17,000 a year, and they will use the basic income as a springboard to develop a better life. I think we also have to be careful about work. Paid work is certainly one form of work, and the vast majority of us do work for pay, but you don't have to have paid work to do work. And certainly what we saw in the pilot is a number of people took a time out from paid work to work in other ways to support their households, to support children who needed some extra attention, to help older parents perhaps that needed attention. These are all contributions to our society that are worthwhile. They may not show up as income in GDP figures, but nonetheless they're beneficial. So again, we just didn't see people in the pilot that we spoke with sitting back and doing nothing. They all engaged in some kind of work, most of it paid, some of it simply supporting people without income. So again, I think the narrative that people stop working because they get a bit of money is simply false.
Thank you, Wayne. And I also want to ask Dana about that, because you were one of the recipients of the project, one of the projects, Dana. Do you think it's true? Would the project reduce the incentive to work?
Absolutely not. I know it certainly wouldn't have reduced my incentive to get out there to do things, because I wouldn't have to worry about clawback. It's almost 75% of what you're earning. So you're actually not being able to break the system or break away from the system. It keeps you in place. So UBI gives you the incentive to get out and get a job. And once you make the certain tax bracket, get the opportunity to work yourself to that position, then I can pay back into my taxes accordingly. But with being on, with ODSP, you and or OW, you're given a 75% clawback on what you're earning. So there goes any opportunities for simple things to get you out the door to get a job. You end up going without meals to go to work. There's a few things in regards to that. And as to what Wayne was saying about helping other people, when I said the first couple of months that I was on the ODSP, I was in support of my daughter who has MS to help her get some independency to move towards her getting a driver's license so she could be independent to look after her 4 children. And she's an hour away. So there was travel expenses and I can't take away from her income. So we worked together to make sure we could move forward together as a family. It's like Wayne said, there was lots of layers that go on in this. But my goal for myself, once she was settled and could get on independently in that regards, it was now my turn to be able to look after me and go forward. I do anything to be working, because the CERB thing, or not the CERB thing, this COVID thing is driving me crazy because I'm more grounded to my home than I've ever been. I would like to be able to be employed, but not at the expense that I'm busting everything I have to get 25 cents to the dollar. I'm not, that's the disincentive, not basic income or universal basic income. By far, that's not that's not what's going to keep us back. I found many people that actually went out and got work when they were on ODSP. I have a few people that did that very thing. They got help through a local agency called Job Quest, which just helps people on ODSP, got jobs, found apartments, all kinds of things. People don't want to sit, they didn't have to worry about clawbacks and still have the prescription covered. It is a very vicious cycle that we're on, and it's not about not getting a job.
Can I add one thing on that as well?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is such an important point, and I think people, and there are critics that conflate the concept of, UBI, which is you get paid regardless of whether you work, and instead people say you get paid to not work. That's of course not the case. That's actually what welfare does, right? Social assistance pays you basically only if you're not working, because as soon as you start working, you face the clawbacks that Dana's talking about. A UBI says you get paid either way. And that's, I think, is such a key point when you think about work incentives, that people think, well, are we talking about a world where you go to work and you get paid versus a world where you can get a UBI? But that's not the world we're living in, right? Those aren't the alternatives. We have to look at the current system. And just to add to Dana's point about the 75% clawback, a clawback is a tax, right? So for every dollar of income you earn, you pay 75% of your OW or ODSP money back. And so the effect is exactly the same as when you go to work and you get a paycheck and then you have to pay taxes on it. And this doesn't prevent you from having to pay taxes. So you pay clawback and you pay your regular tax. So if you made, say, $10,000 or $11,000 in Ontario and you were getting your OW clawed back at 75%, you also pay a 20.05% tax in Ontario, which means that your tax rate is actually 95.05%. And so if you add that up, and if you were making, say, minimum wage, you're, say, making $15 an hour, and if you only get paid 4.95% of that, you're working for 75 cents an hour. And that's the current system. So going from that, it's almost anything you change it to will incentivize people to work. Just to be clear, the 75% clawback is not on the first, I think, about $3,600 of income, but pretty much like once you take, maybe if you get one shift or two shifts at a minimum wage job a week, you'll be past the 3,600, and then you're starting to face the clawback.
Okay, and sort of continuing with you, Samir, the next question is also kind of like a two-part question. How do we know whether the government is able to afford to pay for such a large-scale program? And also, how can we make this appeal to politicians and the wealthy?
That's an excellent question. And I think, and I alluded to this earlier, but I think when critics are worried about basic income, and I just mean normal people when they're worried about basic income, they think, well, I work so hard every day, and then I have to pay taxes to the government, and I can barely make ends meet. How on earth is it fair that someone that doesn't even work gets paid a universal basic income? And what I tried to say earlier is that this is just not the reality of what a basic income is about. Those people would all be made better off by a basic income. So far from thinking that they would have to pay more in taxes, they would actually come off better off. And that might seem totally illogical to everyone. And so I thought I'd just kind of break it down with some numbers that you can take away. So we currently spend every year in Canada, our Canadian federal and provincial governments collectively spend about $250 billion on poverty. $250 billion, not a billion, a trillion. That's $250 billion a year. And this roughly breaks down into three pieces. So the first piece is social assistance programs, which are about 50 billion. I'm going to use really round numbers. So social assistance is about 50 billion. The other 200 billion breaks into tax credits, which are about $100 billion a year. And the other piece is increased costs due to poverty. So you've heard this from the other panelists, but when you have higher levels of poverty, you also have higher levels of healthcare costs and prison costs, and everything in the economy costs more. Everything in the economy works less well. People have estimated this cost as about 100 billion. So what you really see here is three different types of costs. Two are proactive. So two are, let's actually try to solve poverty. So that's the idea of social assistance. That's the idea of low income tax credits. Right now, whether they actually do solve poverty, I think we all know that they haven't, but that doesn't mean that they don't help. The third piece is literally a reactive, right? So it says, don't take your vitamins, don't eat your vegetables. You get a stroke, then we'll take care of you. That's kind of the third cost. So it's really just a waste of money, that 100 billion. It's only there because we failed at solving poverty. So that's $250 billion a year. The second point I want to make is that, and I think I said this earlier, our current system is riddled with tax breaks. Now, I'm a tax lawyer, so I should probably make this clear. People think that our system has tax loopholes, and I quibble with that word, loophole, because these are not unintentional, right? A loophole is something that you were clever and you found a gap in our system and you exploited it to save your taxes, maybe something like that. That's not what our system is full of. Our system has intentional tax breaks. tax breaks that people have voted for to give themselves tax breaks. And many of these things you may even use, but what I'm going to suggest to you is that even though you may benefit from these tax breaks, you benefit this much. The really rich and the people that really lobbied for them benefit this much. And so when you get rid of a tax break, you might lose $100 a year, but it'll help the taxpayer so much more that we can fund a UBI that makes you better off. In terms of numbers, I think I said that poverty costs $250 billion a year in Canada. Our tax breaks cost about $300 billion a year in Canada. There's a bit of overlap, but if you add those together, it comes to about $450 billion. So $100 billion of the tax breaks are actually for low-income people. So you add the two numbers together, and it's $450 billion a year that we spend on poverty and on tax breaks. So when we think about the cost of a UBI, we've already have $450 billion that's sort of not achieving the objective it needs to. And the two main items of these tax breaks that I should mention, just so that I can make them concrete, are RRSPs and capital gains. So capital gains is what is earned by people that own capital and sell capital, stocks or houses or things like that. And you pay less taxes on that when you sell it than if you earned income at your job. You pay actually half as much in tax. So that's a big tax break. It costs us $30 billion a year. And the other one is the RRSP, which a lot of people benefit off of, but it costs Canada $80 billion a year. Now, the funny thing is that the idea behind giving tax breaks for RRSPs and pensions is to make sure that everyone has enough money in retirement. But what's weird about this is that most seniors, something like 80 or 90% of seniors, actually have less money in their RRSPs and pensions than they would if we just took the tax breaks back and paid it out as a basic income. So literally just replacing the RRSP and replacing it with a basic income will make something like 80% of seniors better off. And you would still have the money in your RRSP, you just wouldn't get the tax break on it, right? And the final point I want to make is that, so there's all this money that we could be using to fund a basic income. But the final point I want to make is that a basic income is actually way less expensive than people think it is. So I alluded to the math at the start, which is, let's say we give every adult $24,000 and we multiply that by 30 million Canadians. So you say the cost is $720 billion a year, which is a lot. And critics will say, well, that's a third of our economy. That's more than we collect in taxes. How can we possibly do this? You're crazy. Well, first of all, I explained how we spend about $500 billion already. So that's a big part of it. But the other part is that the 720 billion number is actually wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because the UBI would be paid to everyone. So suppose, let's just consider a doctor making $150,000 a year. So we'd pay her a basic income of $24,000. But it doesn't cost society $24,000. Why? Because we can tax it back. So we can increase her taxes by, say, $15,000 a year. And instead of viewing this as a tax increase of $15,000, you should view this as making her better off by $9,000. We pay her at $24,000 basic income, but then she only has to pay an increased taxes of $15,000. And so on net, she actually gets $9,000, and that's the cost to society. And if you look at it this way, when the taxpayer only has to pay $9,000 for her basic income, and if you add it all up, the true cost of basic income is like a third or a half of the number. And so at the end of the day, you actually result in a system that can make something like 99% of workers better off. The numbers that I look at is something like the average worker would have to make more than about $200,000 a year before they're actually paying more for their basic income. And in fact, you would basically pay 0% taxes unless you make more than about $60,000 a year. And so I think when we make this appeal to politicians and to the wealthy, well, first of all, I think we can tell politicians almost everyone would be made better off. I think that's a great policy. And I think we can tell the wealthy, you know, you might have to pay more in taxes, but a lot of people who are rich don't actually like this concept of having to pay a very high tax rate and then having to work their way into all the different tax breaks in order to reduce their overall taxes. They don't like having to pay my colleague other tax lawyers to help them reduce their taxes. And so what I think you can see here is that there's actually a premium that the rich would pay in order to have a simpler tax system. that they don't have to feel bad for trying to find the tax breaks, that they just are happy to pay what the tax rate is every year and not have to worry about it. And I think you'd actually see rich people and big companies in particular being willing to pay a little bit more. And it actually would only be a little, not a lot, in order to have a simpler system.
There's another major critique about basic income programs, that it would encourage employers to pay less to their workers. Do you agree? I think, Wayne, we can start with you. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and there may be the occasion where someone is able to hire a worker at a lower wage because they have the basic income to fall back on. But I think that's probably not the main impact that a basic income is going to have on the labor market. I think more realistically, the impact of basic income is going to be people are going to say, I'm not willing to work at those crummy wages in those crummy conditions. And if you want me to work for you, you're going to have to up your game as an employer. So I think the far more interesting elements of this question are, what are employers going to do in response to a basic income, where, to be frank, people will not be as desperate. And because they're not as desperate, they may not put up with the same kind of abusive, low-wage, unrewarding employment. But I think this is potentially a real social benefit, because if employers are forced now to provide better, more meaningful, better paid employment in order to get employees, well, that's good for all of us. So I think, you know, the probability that somehow wages are going to fall as a result, this is actually the wrong way of looking at it. I think it's more likely that wages are going to go up, because that's the only way employers are going to be able to get employees. And to be frank, employers don't make profit unless they employ people. And so if they want to make profits, they're going to have to find ways to employ people. So I think it actually could lead to better working conditions.
Okay. And I think another concern people have is that, well, it's mostly what taxpayers have, is that UBI is going to impose a greater burden on taxpayers. And Samir, seeing that you're the tax expert on this, we can start with you. What do you think about this?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that, well, the obvious point is that it'll depend on what kind of taxpayer you are. And so in our tax system, how much taxes you pay will depend on your current income level. It'll depend on whether you earn income through work or through a business or capital gains. And as I think many people are aware, workers tend to have the highest tax rates on their incomes for a given level, whereas businesses or owners of capital tend to pay lower levels. And the reasoning behind that in our tax system is that we're trying to incentivize people to come to Canada, bring their money to Canada, start businesses, start innovation. And that's all fine. But that does mean that it's quite a huge burden that our current system places on employees. And so the way that I've kind of modeled the UBI is to say that it would actually reduce the burden on virtually every worker. Some businesses may face slightly higher taxes. It kind of depends on how exactly I've modeled things. So that's sort of detail that I could share offline. But I think by and large, I think if you're like sort of in the bottom 90% of taxpayers, you know, in Canada, basically every single one of those people is going to actually face a lower tax burden. And just to be clear, you might see your taxes go up, right? So if you say, well, I pay $8,000 a year in taxes, well, now you might pay $10,000 or $15,000 in taxes, but then you'll get a $24,000 basic income from the government. So when you actually take into account the basic income, you become better off. And I guess the reason for that is just these tax breaks that exist today, which most people just don't really get much benefit from. And so that's why, interestingly enough, you know, despite what kind of most people think, a UBI would actually reduce the burden on taxpayers as opposed to increase it.
Could I just add something here? I wanted to come in on Samir's earlier comments. I think he's absolutely right. We run our society pretty inefficiently, and we spend a lot of money on things that we don't get a lot of value from. And so using UBI would be more efficient. But this all wraps up this question: can we afford UBI? Is it going to increase my tax burden? I think this is really wrapped up with what I started in my introduction, is that in the last 50 years, our economy has continued to boom and producing more and more every year. but the vast majority of us have not shared in that boon. So 90% of us don't feel richer, even though the reality is our economy is much richer than it was 50 years ago. Probably each of us is producing twice as much as we did in 1980, but we're not being paid any more than we were in 1980. And so when, Samir talks about the 90%, he's absolutely right. It's the 10% who have scooped all of the gains of the last 50 years. And if there is an increased cost of UBI, it is going to have to come from those 10% who have made out like bandits since 1980. And I think that's where we need to put our attention. We can afford UBI because we're a very rich society. Just the problem is most of us don't feel richer because in fact, we're part of the 90% and we're not richer.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was really great. So we are getting close to the end of our time together. So I think we can take a look at some of the questions we have from our viewers. So I think, Omar, we can start with the Zoom questions, or did you want to do the Facebook questions?
We have quite an active Facebook group as well. So there are some questions here. You let me know how you want to do this.
Yeah, we can start with Facebook.
Okay. So maybe we'll alternate between the two. I have one that was posed towards the start of the talk, and it says, is basic income constitutionally legal, and will it affect trade deals? So that's a heavy question. I'm not sure if anyone wants to pick that one up.
I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I have to be careful because I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I don't have a clue about constitutional law beyond sometimes showing up to class for a few weeks, many years ago in law school. But by and large, the federal government has authority to tax, and so do provincial governments. And provincial governments all have authority to do things like social assistance. So, I don't know the specifics of why it might not be constitutional, but certainly our government federally has the right to tax and create tax credits and tax benefits. And one way of looking at a basic income is as a tax credit. So our current, and this is kind of the way that I've envisioned it, our current tax system has something called a basic personal amount. And many people may not know what that is, but basically everyone benefits off of it. It's something along the lines of the first $10,000 of income you make, you don't pay a penny of tax on. So it's sort of like as if we had a bottom bracket where you pay 0%. Now there's some thinking around this, which is that instead of that, viewing it that way, we should think about this as a tax credit, which is actually legally what it is. It's that you get a credit worth your tax rate times that $10,000. You just only get the benefit of the tax credit if you make enough money. So we could say, why don't we give this tax credit benefit to everybody, whether you make enough money or not? And why don't we make the tax credit a lot bigger? So we basically are turning a small non-refundable tax credit into a big refundable tax credit. And now we have a basic income along exactly the lines that I'm modeling. It's hard for me to think about why that might not be constitutional. It's just kind of a couple tweaks of our existing legislation. It seems pretty clearly within the tax law mandate of the federal government.
And I would just add that Canada already has a couple of very important programs that are like basic income. So the first one that came into being was the Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors, which helps to ensure that seniors don't fall below the poverty line, and that's had the effect of reducing seniors' poverty in Canada to the single digits. Although not everybody files their taxes and may not get the benefit. But the more recent one is the Canada Child Benefit, which goes to low-income families and their kids. And again, the statistics we've seen on that demonstrate that Canada has room to maneuver in this space. So I wouldn't see any constitutional problems with it.
Oh, and you know what? Those are such excellent points. Like the Guaranteed Income Supplement and the Old Age Security, they eradicated elder poverty in Canada. I mean, virtually eradicated. It went from something like a huge proportion of seniors were in pretty significant poverty in the 40s and 50s to the introduction of those programs. And today, where basically seniors are at some of the lowest levels of poverty of any age group in Canada. Those programs are huge. I mean, we pay something like $7,000 a year per adult senior in OAS that almost every senior gets. And the guaranteed income supplement can add like something like $11,000. So you can see a household getting something like $25,000 as a minimum for seniors, which is kind of what we talk about for adults with a basic income. And the Canada Child Benefit is huge and may have taken 1 million children out of poverty in Canada in the last 5 years. And it's something like $6,000 per child. So the idea that, you know, like these are huge programs that we've already done that have been hugely effective at reducing poverty and have not led to widespread economic collapse or, you know, people not working.
Yeah, I think I would only weigh in there very briefly and say that it really would depend on how the government introduces it in terms of the fifth and substance analysis. But most of the commentary around this area recognizes that while it may properly fall under the federal jurisdiction, it would require significant provincial participation and involvement and cooperation. And I think this is comments we've heard so far that this might in fact be the time to explore those types of cooperative relationships given what we've seen in the pandemic. Darshani, did you want to move to one of the Zoom questions then?
Yeah, sure. So we have a question here asking, what age does basic income start?
So for the Ontario pilot, I'm assuming the question is about it was 18.
18, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and all the models that I've looked at are also 18. Some people suggest it shouldn't be for 65 and older because there already are big seniors benefits. I disagree. I think it should include them. If you look on the Basic Income Canada Network website, they have 3 policy options about how this could be modeled. And those are really exciting options that are in the media, and all 3 of them have it as 18 and over. And a big reason why it should be 18 and over is because we do have that Canada Child Benefit for people under 18. But then there is something to think about whether people who, you know, don't have parents or for some other reason might not be entitled to the CCB, whether they should also get it even if they're younger than 18. And I think that's an open question.
Yeah.
Should we move on with the Zoom questions? Okay, there's another question. Will UBI increase the cost of living, like rent, groceries, thereby decreasing the beneficial impact that it is supposed to have?
Yeah, if I maybe could speculate, because I think it really is speculation. I think it's a very interesting question. I think undoubtedly some commodities will go up in price. But I think the balance one has to make here is that people in the lower income brackets, they may see some commodities go up 2 or 3%, but they may see their income go up 30 or 40%, so they're better off. Whereas some people in the upper income brackets may also see some commodities go up 2 or 3%, but actually they will not benefit from UBI. So they'll be net contributor in that case. So I think that the probability that people in the bottom half of the income scale will be worse off because there's a little bit of inflation, because there's a bit more demand in say coffee shops or for healthy foods. I think it's unlikely they're going to be worse off, but that's really speculation.
Yeah, like I've kind of always thought, I mean, I have a couple economics degrees, but I certainly have never practiced economics at all, so I don't know anything about it really. But I've always thought that, you know, you might see a little bit of inflation, like Wayne is saying, but it'll be so small in comparison to the size of the UBI. The other thing is that you might actually see any inflation that you see with the UBI may actually be offset to some extent by deflation resulting from replacing existing programs or for taking away tax breaks, if you're trying to think about it that way. I mean, if people are, I want to say it this way, because I think the concern with inflation is if we give everyone a universal basic income of X, won't the cost of all commodities just go up by X and everyone will be neutral and so it didn't do anything? That I think is very clearly wrong.
Okay, and yeah, I think Sue also asked a question about the concern for inflation, but you've touched on that already. Jesse is suggesting that UBI should include youth 16 and 17 who have withdrawn from parental control instead of just everyone starting at 18. So what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, that would probably be wise. The idea of ensuring nobody is worse off, obviously, on a basic income has to be key here. So there have to be alternatives, I think, and certainly we wouldn't want a situation where younger people who have withdrawn from parental control would be living in extreme poverty. So yeah, I think looking at that sort of thing would certainly be part of any policy decision.
Yeah, those are all the questions from Zoom, Omar, if you want to take over on Facebook.
Sure, we have a few questions on Facebook which already actually have been answered, but let me see what I can do here. There was a question asking for a clarification from Samir about what income level rate or clawback looks like under your proposal.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you'll actually see that it's different if you look at my 2018 presentation slides online compared to what I want today. And a big part of that is just that I've realized that there's more inefficiencies in the system than I was aware of in 2018. But the way that the universal basic income should work is that everyone aged 18 and over who's a resident of Canada should get it. There is no clawback. You will get it at all income levels. So whether you're, well, I was going to say Bill Gates, but he's not Canadian. But you know, whether you're the richest Canadian in Canada or whether you're the poorest, you get the same amount. And the way that's justified is just that you pay more through the tax system as you earn more. So the way this is funded is through the tax system. And I want to mention that point because I'm not trying to suggest that, like if you think about basic income versus social assistance with a clawback, basic income could have a clawback or it could just have higher tax rates. And they achieve essentially the same objective. Like either you reduce basic income or you tax it more through the tax system. The result is kind of similar in terms of the income distribution, but I think doing it through the tax system is fairer, simpler, easier to administer. And what I'm worried about is where you have a basic income like the income pilot in Ontario, where you have a 50% clawback. And I didn't like that so much because if you add that to the tax rate of 20%, you're looking at a 70% total tax rate on the poor, which is very high. It's lower than the current system, but it's still very high. And under my system, I propose a 0% clawback plus a 38% flat tax. So every Canadian is going to have a tax rate of 38%. And I think that's, sure, it's lower for the rich, but more importantly, it's lower for the poor.
We just got another question here. Should there be anybody ineligible from UBI, such as government officials? There doesn't sound like there's, I mean, the MP that was here is no longer with us. He had to run to a committee, and I will emphasize the fact that we invited representatives across the political spectrum from every major party, but he was the only one able to join us in between the committee meetings. But perhaps it doesn't sound like anybody is prepared to answer that. I'll move on to the next question that we have here, which I think was...
I could
oh, go for it. Okay. Yep.
I mean, I've always thought that a basic income should just be for everyone. So I would have said there's really no reason why nobody should be ineligible. I think the area where it might get tricky is whether you allow it to people who are just visiting Canada from somewhere else. You know, all the way from there where I think the answer would be no, all the way up to say students or people who are permanent residents but say not Canadians, where I think the answer should obviously be yes. And the reason I say that is that students, permanent residents are all required to pay taxes in this country. And so I don't see why they, you know, you pay taxes in Canada, but you don't get a basic income in Canada. I think the other interesting case is Indigenous people living on reserves. or for other reason who have exemptions for tax, I think those exemptions from tax result from historic reasons, and that should not prevent them from getting a basic income. They should absolutely be getting a basic income. And if you don't give it to them, you will not see reductions in poverty rates, because much of the poverty rates is from Indigenous people. So
to clarify, Samir, then what you're really suggesting is that universal basic income will actually be a very concrete and significant tool to address the poverty and alleviation of many of the issues in Indigenous communities.
absolutely.
I think Jeremy has a question. I think he says, perhaps I missed it earlier, but would UBI replace programs such as OW, ODSP, CPP?
Maybe I could tackle that one. It's interesting because I had a bit of a Twitter conversation this morning with an economist here in Ontario who doesn't necessarily like the idea of basic income or it potentially replacing ODSP particularly. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it off the top, but for those who came onto the Ontario pilot from ODSP, most of them also received an additional $500 $500 a month disability supplement on top of the regular basic income amount. And as Dana pointed out, they were also provided with their drug cards. But some of the other benefits that derive from ODSP wouldn't have been available to people if they participated in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. So for some people, it wasn't a good fit. And depending on their individual circumstance and their individual disability, they may have been worse off as a result of being on the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. And we need to recognize that there are right now in Ontario, I think around 550,000 people who are on ODSP. And, you know, there's as many individual circumstances that might not work through a one-size-fits-all basic income. So for them, I would think there needs to be additional supplements and insurance that they can maintain health, maintain their dignity, in addition to receiving a basic income by additional supports on ODSP. Now, for OW, people who are living, again, as most of you on this call probably know, people who are on Ontario Works are living in the deepest poverty in society. Getting $731 a month to cover rent, food, right now, you know, household cleaning supplies are really important. You can't afford hygiene products, you can't afford a bus ticket, you can't afford a telephone so a potential employer could call you back. There is no rational evidence-based reason why Ontario Works is set at the rate it is. It's deep poverty, and it doesn't do anything to lift people out of poverty or help them get a job. So for those individuals, and I would think I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but for the folks who are on Ontario Works who saw their benefits increase on the Ontario Works pilot, all of them to a person were better off and were much happier being on the basic income than they were on Ontario Works. I think Wayne referenced the more than 500 really ridiculous rules that people have to jump through and regulations. And so I would think for that group, we'd certainly want to see a basic income replace Ontario Works, which is broken, in my opinion, beyond repair.
If I could just, I mean, you know, there've been a number of questions, and there are a number of questions around basic income that somehow we're going to give people $2,000 a month and say, you're on your own, go for it, see what you can make of your life. I don't think that's what's being thought of. I think, you know, $2,000 a month would allow people to have a certain dignity, have a certain floor, but it's not going to solve the need for a pharmacare program, for instance, and a drug plan. It's not going to solve our housing problem. It's not going to provide access to advanced education for everyone. So we're going to still need a whole suite of other kinds of social supports, as well as the basic income, to allow people to have a decent life. It's just that I think the systems we have right now are just so poorly designed, as Samir suggested, are so expensive. We can just do much better. But basic income is not going to result in everything else going away. We're still going to need a full suite of social supports.
And I can just say, like, specifically to my model, really the only of those programs that I've ever thought about being gone is just OW and equivalents in other provinces, social assistance. Disability should remain, but I think maybe the idea of having a disability supplement might make more sense. But I haven't modeled taking away the money from ODSP. So, and certainly programs like CPP and EI, which were also mentioned, those are fully funded, right? By the people who pay into them. They're both kind of like an insurance program, like you're paying insurance for your retirement or insurance for losing a job. They serve totally different purposes than poverty. And so it makes sense that you should get a UBI in addition to EI if you lose your job, or CPP on retirement, which you worked for. And I totally agree with the point that, you know, like Andrew Yang called basic income a floor where capitalism starts at whatever, you know, the UBI is. I think that's great, but I think it's also a floor where other social programs can start. And I think, like, you know, we have universal health care. We should also have a universal basic income in addition to healthcare, and we should make sure that we have a variety of universal programs that are human rights.
Thank you, Samir. We've got another question. Do you think it is possible to implement a UBI on a province-by-province basis, or would it require a Canada-wide approach to work?
I don't know if Samir or Wayne want to take this, or Dana, but my thoughts, and this comes from a conversation I had just before the shutdown. We had former Senator Hugh Segal in town in Hamilton for actually the release of Wayne and his team's report. And he gave a couple of presentations, but in the car, I asked him that very question. And as some of you will know, Hugh's been working on this issue for a long time. He's convinced that basic income is going to start at the provincial level, similarly to how the guaranteed income supplement started. And it was actually launched by a conservative government in Ontario in the 1970s. He thinks just the way Confederation works and through the division of powers, that it's more likely we'll see a provincial government launch a basic income, probably with the support of the federal government. And then other provinces will see how it's working and latch onto it. Now, that was before the shutdown, before the pandemic, before CERB. So his thinking may have changed on that. But one province in particular is moving forward fairly quickly on it. And it's Prince Edward Island, the smallest province in Confederation. And it's interesting because it has cross-party support. It's actually the Green Party that's in opposition that have been big boosters of it, but the Liberals and Conservatives, and the Conservatives are the government there currently, seem open to the idea, which is interesting. So I think we'll have to wait and see. But again, times being what they are, with the launch of CERB, maybe it does make more sense for a national approach to basic income. But I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on that.
Yeah, if I could, I think, you know, Hugh may be right that province by province is maybe the political reality, but I think a federal program would certainly make a lot more sense. One can imagine all kinds of problems if one province supports that kind of a system and the others don't. And, you know, you start getting movement between provinces and then provinces having to put up residency requirements to get basic income, et cetera. I think it's a very slippery road we might be going down. I think it would be much more efficient if it was a federal program, both from the perspective, the feds, to be frank, have the taxing capacity, but also I think in terms of economic efficiency, it would be better if everyone in Canada played by the same rules.
I agree with everything Wayne said. And I think, like, a big part of it is people think of basic income as an improved version of social assistance, which I think is fair. and provinces have typically done social assistance. But you have to keep in mind that in order to get social assistance, it's like basically impossible. I mean, you need to meet a whole variety of requirements. You need to convince a whole bunch of people. It's a long process. Whereas to get a basic income that's unconditional and universal, you basically just need to reside there. And so that's the problem, that how do we know that you're really in Ontario as opposed to Quebec or Manitoba or wherever? I mean, I'm taking this call right now from Alberta, and because I've got my my parents here, and so we have people to take care of my kid. So how do you know? Which basic income do I qualify for? The one that isn't in Alberta or the one that we're creating in Ontario? And I think when I've tried to model this, I've always modeled it as federal and provincial governments working together, because then you can reform the whole tax system. You can reform everything. I appreciate that's politically difficult, but federally, I have been able to model it in a way that just the federal government doing it, you can actually have a UBI, and you can reform enough of the system to pay for it. Provincially, it's really difficult, and the reason for that is our federal government collects about 12% of GDP in income taxes. Our provincial governments collect something like 4 or 5%, which means that if you're going to leverage those systems, there just isn't the capacity provincially, unless you're trying to just beef up a social assistance system, with sub-poverty levels of income, which I think is just not really what a basic income is all about.
And we have another question as well. Is there any evidence on UBI's impact on public services, such as affordable housing and public transit? So to elaborate, will investments in these areas be simultaneously reduced or remain stable?
That's the political question, I think, right? I mean, I think it depends on what governments choose to do. I think the argument is that if we spend money on basic income, then we'll stop spending it on other things. I personally think that's a terrible idea, but that doesn't mean that voters or politicians agree with me. And I think if you look, though, at other basic income programs that Tom and Wayne have talked about, the OAS, the GIS, and the CCB, so the programs for the elderly and for children, those have not resulted in reductions in social programs at all. And so I don't think the same would happen here. And especially because we're not trying to fund a basic income by slashing social programs. I think we all on this panel anyway agree that a basic income should be funded, through clawbacks and through the tax and transfer system.
If I could, a lot of my friends on my end of the political spectrum are not terribly enthusiastic about basic income because of this exact reason. They think it would be better to plow that money into housing or other kinds of social supports. I actually think they're wrong. I think they're wrong because I don't think basic income is going to solve the housing problem on its own. Basic income is not going to solve the prescription drug problem on its own. We're going to need those other policies. And I think what it really comes down to, at least from my perspective, is how rich of a society we've become. And to be frank, it's a myth that we cannot afford to decently house our people, to provide them with decent drug plans, and to provide them with enough money to have a decent basic life. I just think it's a myth that we can't afford that. We certainly can, and we just have to look at what's happened in the last 50 years and where all our wealth has gone. It's gone to the top 10%. There's plenty of money there to do all those things.
I'm going to add into here where, as a recipient with basic income and live in social housing, thank goodness, I have safe, affordable, and professionally run housing that I happen to live in. That's my opinion. But my rent only went up a small percentage with being on basic income. So my rent with the ODSP went from $139 a month to $605 a month. I could still afford rents in the market. It's not a big market here, so the rents are extremely high. It would be nice to be able to say no to some of the landlords who are trying to, I can't speak for all of them, but trying to like hold on and have these high rents. We can demand better quality housing as well with having that money. But I definitely, my rent didn't go up a whole heck of a lot. It was attainable, and I can still keep what I had. And housing and prescriptions, those definitely things do need to be looked at and made safe going forward as well. But my housing, I was appreciative of that as well, because I didn't have to worry. I also know people being on basic income who managed to get out of a basement with no windows, and that person lived in for some time, to be able to get into a safe home. So yeah, the UBI would definitely needs to be looking at affordable housing in the area as well. We could drive the market back just like we could with employers.
Thank you. We have another question from Jesse. Is there an argument that says the amount of UBI should be dependent on the cost of living of a recipient's hometown, Toronto versus Parry Sound, let's say, or does that just complicate things too much?
I'll take that. It's a really interesting question. And it's something I have a little bit of experience in through another big project we've worked on in the past. It's the Living Wage campaign. And in Ontario right now, I'm not sure the latest numbers, but I think we have 17 different living wage amounts that vary from community to community as cost of living changes. And truthfully, that does make it a little bit challenging, both for calculating how much a living wage should be, as well as for the employers who we're asking to pay a living wage to their employees, who may operate in multiple jurisdictions. So it does create challenges, but it also recognizes that costs do vary from big cities to more rural communities. And maybe that is something to think about, maybe a little bit of an additional supplement for living in big cities with higher housing prices and higher childcare prices. But I would agree with what's already been said. Basic income cannot be an excuse for inaction on other critical social programs like childcare or housing or public transit or pharmacare. We need to do both, and so I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on that. But I think that could be open for an interesting conversation.
If I could say, I think simple is good. I think one of the problems with ODSP is that it is so convoluted, rule bound, and people are having to justify, and you get in this kind of surveillance system. I think simple is good, and it actually is more efficient. So I would argue against changing the rate depending on where you live.
Yeah, I like the federal same rate everywhere you live in Canada, regardless of where you live. But recognizing differences in cost of housing and cost of living, I think it probably makes sense that, you know, if really this actually happens, and we had a universal basic income across Canada, you could see the more expensive cities as considering whether they wanted to create their own supplement through property taxes. I mean, I would think some places like Toronto and Vancouver have had windfalls from massive property taxes because of skyrocketing house prices. Why not use some of that wealth to pay a basic income so that you can continue to have people serving the rich people at restaurants? Like, I mean, I think that makes sense. I just don't think that's a federal solution. And the reason I think that as well, in addition to simplicity, is that you don't want to try to solve an overly expensive Vancouver and Toronto problem by giving people who live in Vancouver and Toronto more money to try to convince people to maybe move there. Like, I think that probably does the opposite of reducing house prices.
What you might see happen if everybody in Canada was receiving the same basic income amount, you might see a migration of people from the big cities back into the rural areas with lower housing prices. And we might see the opposite phenomena of what we saw for most of the 20th century, is people congregating in big cities. We might see a movement back towards more rural areas with lower housing prices and lower costs of living if everybody was receiving the same basic income amount. So it would be interesting to see.
Okay, and we have another question. How would the ultra wealthy hiding money offshore to avoid paying taxes impact the model Samir has proposed with flat rate taxation? Do you think a UBI would increase this behavior with the wealthy, and how would we avoid that reaction?
So I'm not sure if this is a popular opinion, but the dirty little secret about things like Panama Papers is that the actual amount of taxes that are criminally evaded through those things are actually a very, very small drop in the bucket compared to the kinds of things that Wayne is talking about, how the 10% and the 1% have come up ahead in recent years. If you compare sort of, you know, it's almost impossible to estimate how much criminal tax evasion there is in Canada. But I will tell you that even the most significant estimates of that are large in that they're in the billions, but small in that they're much smaller than, say, how much we spend on poverty, 250 billion, or how much we spend on tax breaks, which is 300 billion. These numbers are somewhere between like 2 billion and 40 billion, which is to say very speculative, but very small comparatively. And the other point I should make is that we do a really good job of giving a lot of money to the CRA to investigate these things. And they're not easy to figure out. But the CRA has a big budget, and we could keep giving the CRA an even bigger budget. So just to say that, I think, like, these things are very heinous, but they're a small drop in the bucket. Now, in terms of whether we'd see them increase, I think we would absolutely see them decrease. And I'll tell you why. Our current system is riddled with complexity and has a very high sticker rate. Like, you pay 54% tax in Ontario, but then you find all the ways to reduce your tax rate, right? You find all the way to reduce your taxes. And some people apparently go for illegal criminal ways to reduce their taxes. Well, if we simplify the system and if we lower the rates, I think that means two things. So by simplifying the system, you make it harder for people to A, avoid, and B, evade criminally their taxes. And the second thing is that by reducing the tax rate, you reduce the need to find a way to avoid or evade taxes. If everyone thinks that their tax rates are relatively reasonable, why are they going to go off to Panama, right? And so I've always viewed it that way, that if we just, the simplest way to go is to simplify the tax system and lower the rates and pay out a universal basic income. I think it's fair. I think it's something people can get behind. And I think you'll see less tax avoidance and evasion. And what you will do, as I mentioned before, tax evasion is a drop in the bucket anyway.
Thank you, Samir. And I think this is the end of the questions. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And on behalf of the Durham Community Legal Clinic, we would like to thank all the panelists for taking the time and enlightening us on universal basic income, and of course, sharing their interesting ideas, experiences, and views on this topic. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.